Tony D and little Joan and guest dog Stella in the background. And this is a screenwriter's tip for how to write a story based on historical fact. So, yeah, smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Check out my books. The links are in the description. Comedy horror in South Jersey. It's the Pineys, Stella. Come here, Stella. Books 1 through 18 available at Amazon.com. Don't forget Kindle Unlimited is free. And don't forget your claws hurt there, Stella. They hurt. Stella's a good girl, though. Yeah, you miss your mom. Okay, your mom's coming home soon. Your mom will come home soon. You're a good doggy, okay? Okay, no, don't touch that. All right, go sit in your bed. Go sit in your bed. Here, I'll pet you down here. Pet you down here. All right. So today I'm talking about how to write a movie based on historical fact. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a drama, but a lot of times it is. And it doesn't have to necessarily follow history, but you want to pay homage to the historical fact, although sometimes you're not, right? So the guys who wrote Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, yeah, they're taking some liberties with the historical stuff. So obviously the first thing you want to do is research the material real effing well. And in fact, the research is probably going to dictate the kind of story you're going to write and what you're going to focus on. Sometimes it could be more of a romantic drama. The romance in the period of history might hold the story together, or the drama. Sometimes you're working on a mystery, like who shot JFK, going over all the evidence. But, with me, I do stuff based on history in the Pineys. And what I like to do is find very obscure South Jersey history and take a look at it as best I can. A lot of times there's a lot of gaps in it. And then I write a story which essentially explains the rest of it, how it really rolled out. So I did that very much in book 14, The Pirate Piney, in which I based the story partly on an article from the 1820s about a mutiny on a ship called the LeClaire. So check that out if you get a chance. So what I did was I read the story of the LeClaire, the account in a Cape May newspaper, and then I decided, how the events of the LeClaire happened and what the eventual fallout from those events were. And then I tied it into the characters in the modern day in the Pineys. So you can do something similar, but it requires you to know the history pretty well. Sometimes you can take a lot of liberties. You kind of have to judge what people know and what they don't know. So, for instance, in book 1 of the Pineys, I used a book called The Wallam Olam, which has generally been debunked, but a lot of people don't know that it's been debunked, and there was some cool folk tales surrounding it. So I kind of took some liberties with that, more so than I did with some of the other things, maybe. But it's kind of a cool story, the way it is, even though it's been debunked. It kind of depends on what you're doing. Like, I'm doing supernatural comedy stuff, which means I get a lot of leeway in terms of the comedy aspect of the story. If you're doing historical drama, people expect it, I think, to be more accurate. They want, for instance, the Civil War to end the way the Civil War ended. However, if the Civil War didn't quite turn out the way it was supposed to, for instance, in a comedy, maybe you could make that work somehow. It sort of doesn't matter as long as the comedy's funny. But again, you still should know the history. You still should do enough research that you're basically an expert in it. you don't have to get a college degree, although that wouldn't hurt. Um, but you should have read pretty extensively on the subject, I would think. That's why they're kind of hard. You know, it's kind of hard to write stuff based on historical fact because you need to know those facts, and then you have to write the story based on that fact. So sometimes historical fact can be pretty boring, or the historical facts are all about things that nobody really cares about and doesn't really lend itself to a story. You need to find interesting facts, you know. So, for instance, in book 6 of the Pineys, I wrote about Bloody John Bacon, and I find him a fascinating figure in history. He was a loyalist, pirate, highway bandit, and he operated during the Revolutionary War. He was very loyal to the crown at a time when things weren't going for the crown, not going well. And a lot of people don't know who he was, even though he committed the Long Beach Island massacre. And he was sort of an interesting figure in the American history during the Revolution. And we were never taught about him, even though he's sort of a local, he operated in New Jersey, especially along the coast and towards the south. And not a lot of people are taught about the highway bandits who traveled in South Jersey at that time. I know. Are you okay? I know. It's very disturbing. So, you know, I found, and the other fact about Bloody John Bacon was that he was at the last official battle of the American Revolution, which is pretty interesting in itself, if you read about it. And, you know, it also has to be historical fact about things that other people might care about. So for the American Revolution, people in America tend to care about the American Revolution a bit because it ties into our founding fathers. It ties into the founding of the country. People know some of it. You know, I read about Betsy Ross for book 17 and found out she was a Jersey girl, which a lot of people were surprised when I told them that. She was actually married 3 times during the Revolution. Once to George Ross, whose father signed the Declaration of Independence, and he died early in the Revolutionary War. Then she remarried to a sea captain named Ashburn, who was put in a POW camp. And while he was in the POW camp in England, he met a guy named Claypool. And he got sick. And he told Claypool, if I don't make it out, please go back to Philadelphia and take care of Betsy. Well, Ashburn died. Claypool got out of the prison camp before the end of the war, and he went back to Philadelphia and married Betsy before the end of the war. So 3 times she was married during the Revolution, and was from South Jersey and was an important figure during the American Revolution. So those sort of like salient facts lend itself to some story elements in book 17 of the Pineys. You know, what you start to think about, well, what kind of person who was married so many times, was losing husbands left and right in such a short period of time, you know, you'd have to be a pretty resilient person to think about that. And you'd have to be pretty determined to get married again. Pretty damn determined. So that was interesting. That was an interesting aspect of Betsy. She also eloped with her first husband and was one of 17 or 18 siblings. So, yeah, interesting person, Betsy Ross. So, the main thing is you want to let the history sort of dictate the story a bit, I think. You know, based on some salient fact, you can kind of expand upon it. I didn't expand too much on Betsy Ross. I did take some liberties with her in the story, but you know, and in my stories, I had an explanation of why history was played out a certain way, but was actually different, but you don't know about it. So you could come up with something like that. That's an easy way out of, how come people in how come the history books don't know about this? Why isn't there any evidence? Well, I have an explanation for that in the book. You may not want to go down that path again, especially if you're doing a drama. The drama should probably be more accurate. I don't think people want to read an alternate history drama necessarily, although they do sell in book form. There is a sort of a subgenre of historical fiction that people seem to like. If it's super romancy or it's got a lot of erotica in it, that always kind of sells. The backdrop almost kind of doesn't matter, really. Wouldn't recommend that. But when you're talking about a screenplay, you want something that's visual. You want a time period in history that maybe people don't talk about very much. So, for instance, on Netflix, there is a new miniseries. I think it's called Death by Lightning, and it's about the assassination of one of our obscure presidents whose name escapes me right now. But it's the guy who got shot in the late 18 or early 1900s. I can't think of his name. Was it McKinley? Might have been McKinley. So that's one reason to watch that. For people do tons of war movies on the big war, but 1917 was about the First World War, and that was very different because there's not a tremendous amount of movies about the First World War. There's All Quiet on the Western Front and maybe one or two others. So maybe you want to pick a different history, that's known well enough that people would know that it happened, but not so well that people have seen dramas. The Spanish-American War is one you don't see a lot of stories take place in. There have been interesting crimes throughout history that are also interesting to focus on because people always enjoy a heist or a murder mystery. These, again, can generate the ideas that you want to do. There's another mini series coming out. I forget what it's called now, but it involves a bunch of famous artists from, I want to say, the mid 1900s or maybe just before, and I think Salvador Dali's one of them. And they're all brought together in this manor house by this millionaire. And it's just interesting because they're different artists from history. And people generally enjoy that. And it's fun to see famous actors play famous historical figures, especially if they resemble them. Depending on who they are. Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln. I wasn't much interested in seeing another movie that would lionize Lincoln, but I was kind of mildly interested in seeing Daniel Day-Lewis's take on him because he's such a good actor. There's other things you should know. There's other research you'll have to do. So, for instance, in book 19, which is still coming out, I set it in Ocean City, New Jersey in 1989. And one of the important factors was I had to make sure I wasn't referencing buildings or businesses that weren't built yet in 1989. And I needed a scene in a public park. And I was like, ooh, I did a lot of construction in Ocean City, especially these days. I got to make sure the park was there in 89 and not torn down because they do so much construction. So I found I've been using a site which I mentioned in my talks called historicaerials.com, and they take Google Maps and they layer them by year, and then before that they have these things called aerial maps. You go up in a plane, take a picture of the ground, and they take those aerial maps and they sync them up with Google Maps, and you could see, for instance, what Ocean City looks like in 1987 from the sky. Now, it's not as detailed as Google Map, but it gives you a rough idea of things like public parks and which ones were up. In this case, the closest year I could find was an aerial map from 1987, but that was close enough. I could figure out where the parks were and then look at the next map, which I think was 1991, and make sure it was there, and logically it would be there in 1989. So that was a handy research tool. I also made references to some businesses that recently closed in Ocean City because, I wanted to pay tribute to the older Ocean City. And this would have been true had I placed the story in a place like Atlantic City. There's a lot of old-timey businesses that were fairly famous. Some are gone and some are still rocking. So it's a way to connect to the past and a way to sort of make your story feel more authentic. I made a reference in the 70s to a place called Grendel's Lair in Philadelphia, in Piney story in book 16. And that was, I had never actually been to Grendel's Lair, but I was around when it was still operational in its final days. It was a music venue, and it was pretty much a jazz club for a lot of its run, but then in its final days it became like an alternate music sort of venue with punk bands, and I had heard about it because I was a big fan of punk, but I never actually went into the Philadelphia to Grendel's Lair to see anything because I wasn't big into going in the city at that time, and now I'm not into going into any cities these days. But yeah, so these are the kinds of interesting sort of tidbits of information you can use to sort of steer your story in one direction or another. You don't want to get too bogged down in the details. You don't want to sacrifice, for instance, the flow of the story for the sake of historical accuracy necessarily. Kind of depends on your story. If you got something that's super fast paced and you want to keep the action up, that could be particularly important. And conversely, you might want to slow things down if it's more of a romantic drama based on a relationship. It kind of depends on the genre you're sort of steering the historical story into. So, do your research, and always remember that you have to do an actual story. Always remember that, if you take away the historical elements, it should still hold up as a story. If you moved it to the modern day, would it still hold up as a story? Basically, without getting bogged down in all the details. That's the kind of sort of litmus test you want to use, especially if you're writing a screenplay. Because if the story wouldn't hold up without all those historical elements, you probably have kind of a weak story, and you need to kind of kick it up somehow. And you need to make inferences based on how history played out and what information you can get a hold of. You'd be surprised what you can find if you really search for it. And don't be afraid to get on the internet, especially if you have access to any kind of historical databases, and really search for the specifics. I would say when you do your searches in a search engine and you've got some access to historical knowledge, what you want to do is start very specific, and then if you don't get enough information, is just slowly start broadening those search terms bigger and bigger until you get something. But you want to start pretty specific, because you might get lucky, as I've done a couple of times in my research. Sometimes you get lucky and you get exactly what you need. I can't tell you how happy I was to stumble upon the tunnels in Williamstown for book 18. It was just like, oh my God, this is so perfect. I couldn't have scripted it better. So there are tunnels underneath Williamstown, New Jersey, and they were built in the early 1800s for the glass works that were there for about 115 years. So yeah, and you'll be surprised at what you find, and don't be afraid to use historical tidbits that aren't very well known. You want to confirm it, kind of like a journalist. I try to find at least two sources for even a folk tale. You know, if I could find at least two sources, I could say, okay, there's at least two different publications that confirm this. So it's probably true, or true enough, or in the public zeitgeist that you could probably include it, even if later somebody says, oh, that was debunked, or that they, experts say that's probably not the case. I mean, at least there's some argument there for your history. And the further you go back, the blurrier it's going to get. Because the further you go back, the less information. Once you get back before the time of the printing press, you're talking, good luck. I mean, it's very rare to find any historical evidence, that far back. The only thing you'll be able to find is if you're lucky enough to stumble upon a diary by a guy who could actually write and read, and and the chances of doing that further and further back are pretty remote. So, do what you can, do your research, and of course, never forget the 3-act structure. And that's it for me, Tony D and Little Joan. I hope these tips were enlightening. If you have any suggestions of your own, or any kind of specific screenplay or story questions you want to ask me, feel free to put it in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow for the live stream.